Before I dig directly into Nephi's Apocalypse, which encompasses 1st Nephi 11 to 14, with some explanatory material in chapter 15 as well. Before I get into that, I'd like to do an overview of those chapters so we can kind of get a sense of the big picture of Nephi's vision and Apocalypse, and then we'll go into the details chapter by chapter. I should note that chapter 10, verse 22 is probably the introduction to chapter 11 rather than the conclusion of chapter 10. Here, Nephi says, the Holy Ghost gives authority to Nephi to speak these things. Now, it's possible it means the things that have already been spoken in chapter 10, but I suspect it's saying these things are chapters 11 to 14. And he's also told he can't deny them, which means it's a command not just that he is allowed to, but that he has to. So it's a command to write the vision that we find in 11 to 14. Now, it's interesting that this verse has the passage, the Holy Ghost giveth authority. The concept of authority is intimately linked up with priesthood in LDS conceptions, and rightly so. But this is probably not a mention of priesthood authority here. We need to understand there's other types of authority. In ancient Israel, priesthood authority was essentially a function of the temple. That is, people, if they served in the temple, were priests. If you didn't serve in the temple, or excuse me, if you weren't a priest, you couldn't serve in the temple. There's basically an intimate connection between those two concepts. The Holy Ghost, or the Spirit, or the Ruach in Hebrew, is the foundation for prophetic authority and assignment. Now, you can be a prophet without being a temple priest, or you could be a temple priest without being a prophet. So when Nephi is given authority here, I think it's referring to the Ruach, Spirit, prophetic authority, rather than a conflation with our concept of authority. So basically, there's more than one type of authority. Priesthood authority is, of course, important, but I think Nephi is not talking about that in this particular case. Now, when we turn to the Apocalypse in chapters 10 to 14, first thing we need to note is that these chapters are divided into conceptual units by the phrase look. And essentially, when the angel says look, it means it's a new part of the vision, a new element, a new idea. So we need to pay attention to that language, because when we see the word look appear, we know, okay, something new is going on, something's changing. It's a new concept. Okay, this Apocalypse is composed of 11 chapters, chapter 11 through 14, 4 chapters, with a chapter 15 kind of as an appendix where he kind of explains some things about it. But the essence of the Apocalypse is chapters 11 to 14. Now, the first thing to note is that those chapters each have a link back into Lehi's vision in chapter 10, verses 4 to 10. Or excuse me, the whole of chapter 10. That is to say, Lehi has a vision of something, and then Nephi has another vision, and that vision expands and builds upon Lehi's vision. So Lehi has the core ideas are all there in Lehi's vision. But that takes up one chapter, and then that's all expanded into 4 chapters, fairly long ones, in Nephi's vision. So pay attention to the connections back to what Lehi has. And notice also the vision of the tree of life in chapter 8 is also intimately connected with these ideas in chapters 11 through 14. So we've got 2 foundation documents, the vision of the tree of life and Lehi's prophetic vision in chapter 10. And then those 2 ideas are merged together and expanded in chapters 11 through 14. So that's the big picture of what we're going to be talking about when I turn to chapter 11 and go through those chapters in detail. Chapter 11 is essentially about the ministry of Christ, and following his crucifixion, the ministry of the apostles. So basically, Nephi is having a vision of the future, and the first thing he learns about is more information about the Messiah. which had been introduced by Lehi. So, chapter 11, prophecies of the Messiah and his disciples. Chapter 12 then is based on 1 Nephi 10:13, and this is a vision of Nephi's descendants in the land of promise. So we get this vision of the of Christ and the apostles, and then we kind of jump backwards to Nephi's vision, or Nephi's own descendants, Lehi's descendants. And here he has another vision of the 12, of Christ and the 12. These are the 12 in the Holy Land. And essentially a vision of the coming of Christ to the new world, paralleling that in the old world, and then also of the fall and destruction of the Nephites. So you have Christ's first appearance, then he appears in the new world, and the Nephites fall in destruction. Okay? Then part 3 of the vision is chapter 13. And in this part, this parallels 1 Nephi 10, 11 to 12. In this part, Nephi jumps back to the Gentiles and has his vision of the great and abominable church. And notice that we have the fall of the Nephites in chapter 12. We have the fall of the Gentiles and the age of the Gentiles and whatnot, and the fall of the great and abominable church and all that stuff, their apostasy in chapter 13. So the point is, Christ comes to the old world, creates the church, but the church falls into apostasy with the great and abominable church. He comes to the new world, creates the church, and the church falls into apostasy with the destruction of the Nephites. So there's a precise parallel in the visions between both of those things. A theophany, a manifestation of Christ, formation of a church, and the apostasy of that church. In the old world, it's great and abominable church. In the new world, it's the Nephites. So that's kind of the big picture on chapter 13. Then in chapter 14, which is related to 1 Nephi 10:14 of Lehi's vision back in chapter 10. In chapter 14, basically we have the great and marvelous work, which is the restoration. And this is the vision of coming forth of the Book of Mormon, the acceptance of the book, all that type of stuff. So in other words, it's the restoration. So the solution to the problems of the apostasy is in chapter 14, which is the restoration. Now that's the big picture of what's going on. Then in the end of chapter 14, Nephi links his own vision with the book of Revelation, but doesn't give any details. Well, he talks about it a bit, but essentially stops at that point and doesn't go beyond the restoration in terms of his prophetic vision. Then lastly in this sequence, we have chapter 15, in which basically Nephi explains the vision of the tree of life to Laman and Lemuel. There's different reactions of the people to these visions, and some question and answer about the tree of life and all that type of stuff associated with the earlier visions that both Lehi and Nephi had of the tree of life. So that hopefully gives you the picture of what's going on in the big picture of chapters 11 to 14, which I call Nephi's Apocalypse,